welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Lorraine Besser. She's a professor of philosophy at Middlebury College, who specializes in the philosophy and psychology of the good life and teaches popular courses for undergraduates on happiness, well being, and ethics. An internationally recognized scholar, she was a founding investigator in the research team studying psychological richness. And she's also the author of two academic books, The Philosophy of Happiness, an interdisciplinary introduction, and and Eudaimonic ethics, the philosophy and psychology of living well, and dozens of professional journal articles on moral psychology. And her newest book is called The Art of the Interesting, What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. Lorraine, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Absolutely. And then so in Lorraine's book, she wrote, there really is something pure and simple about pleasure. Just feeling it makes you want to do the happy dance. Think about some of the most clear-cut examples of pleasure. A cat nap on the couch, a hug from your child, the sparks that fly during a good first date. Pleasure can get complicated, but its value shines in these little moments. We could push and ask why pleasure is valuable, why feeling good is good for us, but I don't think we're really being honest when we do so. We know pleasure is valuable simply through our experience of it in the moment, seizing the moment. The goodness of pleasure is tangible and obvious, but look around. How many people do you see pursuing a life full of pleasure? Not a lot, probably. That's a helpful sign that you should go a long way toward putting the cult of happiness into perspective. Happiness is not the pinnacle of a good life. Happiness does not exhaust a good life. Many of us know this deep down. Happiness isn't the most important thing in life. So this is so counterintuitive and
Yeah.
super counter to what we normally get from podcasts, popular books, self-help stuff. It's usually happiness, 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 right? So I'm going to ask you the most basic question in this that's possible, probably the most basic question today. Why shouldn't the pursuit of happiness be the foundation of all that we consider to be a good life?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so to take the pursuit of happiness as the foundation for a good life, you are really setting yourself up for, I think, a challenging pursuit that will never really end as you want it. So happiness, we know, is a state really marked, as you just read there, marked by pleasure. And the thing about pleasure is that it doesn't last, right? It's part of our reward system, and so it's built in as part of us to like experience pleasure as reward, but then it's got to dip down. And no matter what we do to try to like harness or fight that adaptation, we're just really not going to succeed. And so, what I really think is that in the wake of all of this literature on happiness, which we have and which is awesome, right, it really pays to slow down and think about, what is the literature about? What is it really showing? And what role do I want that to play in my life?
Hmm.
Absolutely. And actually you would think if you really think about it, when you are pursuing happiness, you're pursuing pleasure, and those moments are fleeting, right? How can that really sustain you? You're just essentially just chasing the next thing, right? And how could that be the pillar for a good life,
Right.
right?
Oh, and you know what's so interesting about that? So I don't want to get super duper clinical because I actually want this to more so be a philosophy episode, but whatever. I mean, I'll try to kind of stay
Yeah.
away from it a little bit. So like if you think about something like, and again, not necessarily the focus of the book, but if you think about something like bipolar disorder, right? So a lot of
Sure.
times what happens is people chase the manic versions of it. So like the manic or hypomanic episodes. So what's so interesting about that is that like if you ask somebody with, let's say either bipolar disorder or with somebody who just has an interest in it, a lot of times they think like, but why shouldn't I want that, right? Like that's great, right? Sort of if I'm just happy all the time, why isn't that a good thing, right? And Lorraine, you touch on this, right? Where the idea is that happiness in itself, it's not a bad thing, but when it's sort of prolonged, right? Constitutionally speaking, we're not sort of built for that. So before I even kind of get into like bipolar disorder and what I think about sort of the manifestations of it and kind of the downsides, I actually want to ask you, Lorraine, what happens when happiness is actually sort of taken to its extreme, and what happens when that does become the full pursuit of one's life?
Yeah, I think what we start doing is just trying to recalibrate after every dip, right? So if we are solely focused on attaining a happy state, then what we're going to do is need to pursue more and more different sources of pleasure. And we'll continually be like recalibrating ourselves to try to like get to that next best state.
Mm.
But we can't game the system. It just, it's so tempting and we have so much power in our lives and in all areas, but we just can't get that control that we want over our physiology. It's just not going to happen. And my experience is that when we get in that mode and we just try, then we're really bummed out when it doesn't work. And that's just that does nothing for us, right? And so I really advocate this way of, you brought up in that initial quote, the happy dance, right? I really advocate that way of looking at happiness, right? So it's something that's awesome when you have it and you enjoy it when you have it, do the happy dance, and just kind of let it go when it goes away and move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to really quickly add to that. So, yeah, going back to the manic episode. So, when somebody's again in a manic or a hypomanic episode, the thinking is a lot of the times, unfortunately, so there's an exaggerated sense of self. There's, let's say, recklessness in some sense, where it depends on the state, obviously. If it's hypomanic, I mean, you're not making significantly terrible decisions, but when it's a really like a significant manic episode, you are. So, but the point is to say that when we're super, super happy, it seems like and research shows this, obviously, not just in terms of well, like a clinical picture. We're just talking about just people who are just generally happy. What happens is the critical part of our minds kind of shut off. So it's sort of been argued in some sort of way that when we're more or less, let's say, depressed, or at the very least, when we're more or less, let's say, dissatisfied, let's say that, not to be super extreme about it, what tends to happen is we become sort of more our orientation is toward problem solving. But when somebody's extremely happy, they tend to overlook things that they probably shouldn't. They may not necessarily even kind of like acknowledge flaws that might be sort of happening around them. And so the thinking is, if somebody were to be perpetually happy, fundamentally speaking, the reason why, or one of the reasons, not to kind of reduce it to one thing, but one of the reasons why they can't be fully happy all the time is because if all of these different problems are occurring around you, there's no possible way, if you're not trying to solve them, and if you're like, hey, everything is great and I feel so good about myself and everybody loves me and I don't do anything wrong, I'm not making any mistakes or whatever, right? There's no way that that's sustainable and just sort of the systems that we tend to exist in.
I see. So you're saying people would have somebody pursuing happiness like that, at least
Yeah.
to the extreme, would have blind spots to
Right.
other important things going on in their own life.
Right. And
Sure.
I would even argue that happiness in that respect would also be a delusion too, like once it gets to that point. Because if you're really thinking, okay, I'm so happy, I have everything I've ever wanted, everybody loves me, et cetera, again, there's no way that that can possibly be true.
Yeah. And that brings me to another question. This is something actually that, so having read your book, this confused me a little bit, but this is a great opportunity to speak to the author about this. So, you also mentioned that the pursuit of meaning, although that's a great, it's a noble pursuit, right? It's also not going to kind of get you the good life. What exactly is flawed, would you say, about the pursuit of meaning? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Let's start by saying I think it's great, just like happiness is good, right? These are all
Right.
important parts and but with both of these different kinds of experiences, meaningful ones or happy ones, they're both limited, right? And
Mm.
so they can really only play a limited role. And the way in which the pursuit of meaning or fulfillment or achievement, whatever you
Mhm.
want to call it, I think that's limiting in several areas. First, as we know, whenever you are kind of whenever you're really pursuing some kind of achievement or some kind of accomplishment, then what you're really doing is ending up narrowing your focus, right? So you're putting up blinders, right? To just as we talked about with happiness a little bit, right?
Okay.
You're putting up these blinders, right? Like, so you're only focused on the end goal and then everything just gets cut out. And I think given the nature of our society, what we do is tend to think that's okay, right? We tend to privilege and think, no, this is so important that I do this. And that's okay, right? I mean, we need to prioritize these things in our lives, but we also need to be aware of how also the search for fulfillment works within our minds. And we tend to think, of course, that like because this achievement is so important to us, that when we get there, it'll just be this very robust, fulfilling state. But it just doesn't work like that, right? So we know about, for example, the arrival fallacy, which is the
Hmm.
difficulties that we have in predicting how something will make us feel. And there's been lots of research on this. One of the studies that I just hit me very early on is research about post-tenure depression, right?
Mm.
It is such a real thing. And here we are, like it just happens when professors like we've worked all of our lives to get this great position, and then we're rewarded with like a very tangible reward, a lifelong position doing what we love.
Hmm.
And yet all it it just feels very empty when it happens. And so I, yeah, those are just a couple of the reasons why I worry about this really pursuit of meaning.
You know what's interesting? I think my error and why I was confused is that I was conflating pursuing meaning with, I suppose, having some sort of a purpose. I think that's where my error came. Yeah, because I
Yeah.
was thinking, oh, if you have some kind of a purpose that you're striving for, and somehow I was thinking that's just like meaning, but when you have a purpose, you kind of also put not just blinders. So I agree that yeah, you put blinders to other things on the to try to get some sort of achievement or produce something, or let's say like getting that job or getting the money. Like absolutely. But then when I think of purpose, I imagine you having this grand goal that you want to achieve, and it kind of puts also blinders, but kind of blinders to I don't know, like things that would distract you, but like in a
Mm.
negative sense, like kind of like as if like the grander the purpose, it almost creates like these like automatic personal boundaries to maybe could be even like things like negativity or distracting thoughts or
Mm.
something like that. Because imagine like if there's something big that you want to achieve, that thing that maybe somebody said about you, if you're gonna let that affect you, it's not gonna let you achieve that purpose, right? But actually, thank you for giving explaining the distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think though I do worry about and discuss this kind of sense of purpose that you are alluding to. And, I again here worry that if we set our eggs and really just try to, you know, figure out our purpose and like really think that we need one true purpose in our lives and seek out to find it, we're just setting ourselves up for a very kind of disheartening situation. I think it's, we do hear stories of people finding purpose and finding it fulfills their lives, but we hear stories about it because it's so rare. And so
Okay.
if it happens, great, but it doesn't seem to be the best strategy for most of us. If we're just really trying to improve our lives, I think there's a lot of other things we can be doing than really kind of sitting around thinking about what our purpose is.
I
Interesting.
love that.
So
Yeah.
then, oh, if you don't mind,
No, go for
this leads me to the next. This is actually very important.
it.
So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No,
Okay.
so then in that case, I wonder what sort of personal experiences sort of inspired you to explore the concept of the interesting as a critical component of the good life. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. During the time in which I started thinking about this research, this project started through collaboration with a psychologist, Shigehiro Oshii,
Hmm.
and he was the one who first kind of introduced this idea of psychological richness and interesting experience to the table. And together we worked to really try to understand its role in the good life. And at the same time that was happening, I was experiencing a very pivotal period in my life. I was just about to, I was just right on either about to get tenure or got tenure. I certainly got tenure during that process, and so was experiencing that awkwardness. I was a new single mom with two children and being the primary caretaker, and I was just over my head, and yet I was very successful, right?
Mm.
And what I found myself being in this position, and I think this many of us find ourselves here from time to time, right? Of just trying to keep going and get through. And
Yeah.
I'm great at executive functioning. I like, that's a skill and I can do it, right? And I can succeed. But then I'm looking around and, the collapse of my first marriage really helped, help put the stick on me for a little bit
Right.
to just try to look around and say, my life is actually really impoverished.
Mm.
I have this family, but I'm just struggling so hard at work. It's hard to really enjoy, and I am really, pushing away and getting tenure. And I published the first book at this time. I'm getting the things, and I'm really just not feeling like I'm living a great life.
Mm.
So there was the advent of this research track in my life really kind of came at this time for me where I needed something different. I was very aware of the limits of fulfillment,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed something different. And the second thing that happened along these lines is that I started dating a man who's now my husband, and he it was just remarkable to really be around someone with to be around him. And what was really distinctive about him, about Jody, is that uh, he really just lived through his passions and he
Mm.
saw the world differently.
Mm.
We'd go on drives and, we'd go away for a weekend with a canoe under the top of our car and not a
Mm.
single plan.
Mm.
And we would just explore. And it was just so liberating and freeing. And I really, through spending time with him, I learned to see the world in a different way. I learned to actually notice all of this things that are out there sitting right in front of us, and I learned to let them in. And I learned how powerful that can be towards really enhancing your life just by noticing things, letting them in, by loosening up the kind of hold that plans have on you. All of this stuff for me really awakened a part of my mind that hadn't been activated.
Huh.
It was when I was younger, like it tapped into this kind of spirit I had when I was younger. But, at that point, 40 years old, in that position, that had been like, that felt very far distant in the past.
Mm.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and it's like I love that you use Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia because ultimately what you're saying is that fundamentally one aspect of any of this is going to kind of cause you to regress in some sort of way. Like so, just to note a quote that I frequently mention on the show from from Disney's Cool Runnings. It was this great quote from John
Okay.
Candy where
Sure.
he said, "If you aren't enough without a gold medal, you essentially won't be enough with one." Right, and part of that is actually something you said, or part of the reason why is something you said. So remember when you made that comment, that I'm going to let you make it. So about the mentality. What happens when you start thinking about, oh, I'll be happy when?
Oh, right. Yeah, essentially when you have this sort of idea of like, okay, I'll be happy when I get this. I'll be happy when I achieve this. I'll be happy when this happens, right? Essentially, you're conditioning your brain to only feel happy when you get something in the future, right? But then the thing is, because you've conditioned your brain to do that, even when you get that thing, you've essentially programmed yourself to still be looking for the next thing. So you'll never actually have that happiness. And then actual happiness is sort of in the moment, in the engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I got to ask Lorraine. So do you find that is there an outlier in all of this? Like, have you seen in any of your research that one person who's like, "Oh my God, I finally did it. I waited years to get this thing, and now
I'm a
I
philosopher king now.
right, and that's it.
It's in
I'm
the book.
fully fulfilled. I did it."
Yeah, I have not.
Yeah.
I really have not. And I would be suspicious if I heard somebody, I mean, I I think this is a really hard trap to avoid, right? It's when
Right.
you work so hard on something and you care so much about something, you really do. It's really hard not to build expectations, right?
Mm.
And then it's really hard to find when they don't come through, even in my own life, given that I'm really aware of this and it's on me.
Mhm.
I really have to remind myself, right, that no, like this is normal, it's okay. And I also really do try to find some moments when they come, right? So I get a great review of a book or something like that.
Mhm.
I really do try to take it in and spend time with it and just try to let it bloom, to the extent that it can.
Mm.
And that helps, right? That does let you take it in, but we're talking moments, right? We are
Right.
really talking moments. And I think that we can do things to experience more moments of fulfillment, but they're not going to stick around. And, I loved what Alan, you said about the kind of recalibrating and expectations and all of that stuff, right? And that's exactly, when you're really successful getting those accomplishments, right? That you just have to keep going and going. And so that does limit, the kind of rewardingness that we can feel at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also add, so the interesting thing also about success is that first of all, number one, it's very infrequent, right? That's I would say the more obvious point here. But the less obvious point is that if you actually look around at people's potential, what they have to offer, technically speaking, success should be more widely shared, right? Not just amongst your own accomplishments, meaning like there's definitely elements of whatever you've achieved that, let's say, are founded in other elements with other people, through having mentors, through collaborators that maybe are not necessarily acknowledged. But the point is also to say that a lot of what you do, other people can do too, right? Whether they are or aren't recognized, a lot of times is related to luck, is related to your social network, your ability to self promote. To be honest, this is fucking America. So, with all of that being said, I wonder if an aspect of why success, and I mean, I think the answer is going to be yes, but I'll ask anyway. If an aspect of why success is A, so unsustainable, and B, why we need, again, eudaimonia, why we need these other elements, is because fundamentally success, when you look at, when it's without all the trappings, right, the sort of decorations of it, it's actually fundamentally not so great, meaning that like, A, there's a lot to it, meaning it's not just you. Like, you know how like if you go to the gym and like the people kind of lie to you, do like, yeah, that was all you and it wasn't all you. It's kind of like that, right? And then on top of that, so many other people probably could have done what you did. Unfortunately, they may have not had the chance, right? So with all of that being said, do you feel like a lot of why success on its own isn't sustainable is because, again, when you strip it down to its core, it's pretty much not that great objectively?
Yeah, I love that framework of looking at it. Success, right? Like when you're thinking about what it is objectively, whether it's degree, a project, a plan, right? It is actually a small piece of the whole kind of system out there. And I also think that when we look at it objectively, right, and we think about how it interacts with our minds and what we need psychologically speaking, right, it's really tangential to the other kinds of experiences that are rewarding and that do fulfill us, right? So social interactions, of course, right, like those are going to be really fulfilling, and yet. Gosh, what are we doing when we are pursuing success so much, right? We're siphoning them off or getting into kind of interactions that are like seeking someone's approval or all of the
Mm-hmm.
the sorts of interactions that aren't that fulfilling. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about psychological needs. That was actually the basis of my first book, and so, and that really is in the background of a lot of my thinking of this, right? When we need rewarding experiences, but what makes them actually rewarding is what we need in our minds, right? So our
Mm.
minds make them rewarding for us. And success, it's just kind of an outlier. In a way, it's similar to, materialism, right? A materialistic goal, right? It's just kind of an outlier. We think it's really great, but it can take us away from what we actually really need and will find rewarding.
Oh, can you speak on that? So in terms of materialism, because usually when people think of it, they're like, "Oh, of course I want to be rich." So what's the dark side of that?
Oh yeah, the dark side of that. I love this. Tim Kasser has this great article on the dark side of materialism,
Mm.
and the dark side in his research, he's a psychologist. In his research, the dark side really shows up in uh, the trappings of the nature of the goal is a very extrinsic to us, right? So it's a goal that doesn't satisfy our innate psychological needs, and so it's this extrinsic goal. And what we do when we try to pursue material success is really kind of put our focus and our energies on things that are really external to us. And then when they're out there and they're external to us, we're looking to, other people to validate them
Mm.
and we're looking at other people's reactions, and we're really coming to define ourselves externally, right? Like
Mm.
how rich am I, or how much am I recognized for this accomplishment? And it it doesn't, there's all sorts of negative psychological effects that crop up when you get put in this cycle of pursuing these kind of extrinsic goals. And so materialism, the dark side is that it's pretty dark, right? It glows from the
Mm.
external stuff,
Mhm.
but if you give it a real role and focus within your lives, it doesn't pan out to be anything rewarding, is more liable to cause, negative states like depression.
Yeah, my hypothesis there is that fundamentally, whenever you get the thing, like what you were saying, because you're still in that mindset of like, I need more and more. I think fundamentally what happens is, and look, maybe this is a little bit based on anecdotal evidence. I would wonder what the research shows on this, but it's like, because whatever we build up in our heads, we think, okay, this is what's going to happen when I get these things. And then when you don't have them, the only recourse you kind of have is other people's envy. So at that point, when you're like, hey, this thing isn't making me happy, I'm still really depressed, I feel like shit about myself. But if this person envies me and maybe a couple of other people, then I start to feel good about myself. Then all of a sudden, now, first of all of your actions were pretty much, not maybe your actions, but all of your maybe goals were means to an end, right? So, or were means to ends. Essentially, the ends essentially were wealth, status, whatever, right? And then when you finally get it, then that becomes a means to an end because now you want other people's envy. And then maybe when people envy you, you're like, hey, that's not so great. What do I do now? So it's kind of interesting because I wonder if, again, like the goalposts keep moving and moving because fundamentally none of this stuff seems to work.
Yeah, and I think that's the bottom line there, right? So
Mm.
fundamentally, a lot of the things that we think are important and will enhance our lives don't. We're just wrong about a lot of these things. And so, but there are better ways we can go about it, right? So we can learn a lot more about ourselves and our minds and think about how it is that even how our mind processes experiences and so that they are rewarding for us. And a lot of that, right, as we're kind of getting at here, is
Yeah.
bringing it back inside, right? And really thinking about what will reward you and what you can do internally, as opposed to just always looking outside for something to make our lives better. It's just not going to happen.
Absolutely. And actually, this is something I think we should define, right? What actually is psychological richness? And should we equate that to the interesting part in the art of the interesting?
Yeah, thank you. So,
Yeah.
psychological richness describes the impact certain experiences have upon the mind, right? It's a state of very robust cognitive engagement where it's really kind of like free-flowing, unstructured thoughts and emotions, right? So, psychological richness develops from conditions of novelty, complex, and challenge, and it is really demarcated by this experience of really unstructured ripples, I call them,
Mm.
of thoughts and emotions that if you let them, right, they'll happen. And so I go about this thinking about in terms of the interesting. And what that describes is how it is that all of the different kind of very different psychological rich experiences, what they have in common that makes them really valuable. And so, psychological richness, we can have them in so many vast different kinds of experiences, and it's never going to feel the same. It's never going to look the same
Mm.
for anybody, and it'll crop up different emotions within one experience, within others, and yet when we're in this kind of state, it still feels very compelling and attractive to us, and that's because it's interesting. And so the interesting is a quality of these experiences. It's how these experiences feel.
Mm.
And in my philosophical work, I've shown that the interesting is really kind of the value attached to them that makes them good. So we can have, experiences of unstructured thoughts and engagements that are not, something that resonate with us, that are not good. And we've all probably had that experience. Yet, when there is, when when something taps into your sense of interest, and
Mm.
so stimulates an interesting experience, right? That's the good stuff. That's what's really that we respond to, and that's the stuff that contributes to our good lives.
Mm. And do
And
you separate in terms of interesting? So do you separate what's interesting in and of itself or for itself, or as opposed to something that's interesting for some greater goal or let's say for some greater pursuit?
Yeah, thank you. So I neither of those things actually. So I think, there are so many different senses of interest that we use out there, right? And in kind of trying to define the category of the interesting, what I'm trying to get at is simply how you respond to something, right?
Mm,
So it arises from the synthesis of like whatever you're doing and what you're bringing to it. There's like a great kind of like combustion of interesting experiences. And so for that, there's no one thing that everyone will find interesting, and even what an individual finds interesting can change over time, right?
mm,
But what's really important in my perspective is to then really zero in on the feelings of the interesting,
mm.
and to really stay attuned to when you're feeling it sparks, and then allow it to develop.
Oh, wow.
Interesting. And
No pun intended.
no, of course. I didn't even think of that. So then I suppose uh, how would we differentiate, I suppose, the interesting from, I suppose, feeling either a sense of awe or from accessing, I guess, flow state, if I may ask.
Yeah, great. Both two really valuable experiential states. And I love that your mind went to thinking this is they're similar, of course, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to kind of tap into. I think most of us are familiar with flow states, right? Where
Yeah.
where everything's just functioning in this great robust way. And so a flow state, though, what happens, what's distinctive to it is that you really kind of lose your sense of self while you're in the
Mm,
moment, right?
Okay.
So you are one with your activity, and there is a different kind of state of consciousness, I think, that's attached to that, right? And it is, marked by this loss of sense of self. So you're not thinking about like, oh, it's I who is doing this thing. You're just doing it, right?
Mm.
And so I think that's different from really having an interesting experience, right? There is no we. What's really distinctive about interesting experiences is how these thoughts are landing on us and how we're reacting with them, right? So there's a very interactive element that is more self-conscious than happens in flow states.
Hmm.
And with respect to awe, I've thought a lot about this, and I've come to decide that awe is really similar. We tend to think, when I describe the interesting, many people do, I think, go to awe and think like, oh, that's really similar. But the latest research on awe, and so I'm thinking about like Dr. Keltner's book on awe.
Mhm.
What he's really carving out as the category of awe experiences are these experiences that are really marked by this transcendence, right? So you're in the experience of something bigger and better, and that you really can't explain or really kind of like make concrete,
mm,
right? So it's this definite awe-inducing kind of thing.
Mhm.
And awe, when you're in a state of awe, right, you can't make sense of things. There's a lot of uncertainty, and yet you're also not really driving to clarify the uncertainty, right? You're just kind of like moved by the vastness of something.
mm,
Mhm.
And that state is, you would think in its initial seeds, it's pretty close to the interesting, but there's never anything that really kind of lands when you're in awe, right? It
mm,
is this very kind of removed experience. And whereas when you're having an interesting experience, there's much more contact with what it is, whatever it is that you're experiencing. And
Mhm.
there is less of this kind of blown away experience, right? When we're like blown
Okay.
or awestruck, right? We feel like, oh, we don't know what to say. We just know how to take it in and just wow.
mhm,
But when we're having an interesting experience, we're having thoughts, we're having emotions, we're like engaging, and I'm moving my hands a lot here, which many people won't see, but
mm,
we are engaging in like a more rapid succession. And so all experiences lack that kind of really robust cognitive engagement where there are
Mhm.
new thoughts and curiosity going and new emotions. And I think it is instead a very important, rewarding experience, but it doesn't have that engaged aspect that is distinctive to interesting ones.
Hmm.
Interesting. So, and then philosophically speaking, so as opposed to, let's say, being an Epicurean or a Stoic, would you call yourself more so an Aristotelian?
Yes and no.
Mm,
I do believe Aristotle, defends eudaimonia, which I think is super important. And I the way I think about eudaimonia though is a little bit different than of a different kind of category than it than I think about the interesting, right? So when I think about, interesting experiences or happy experiences or fulfilling experiences, thinking really like at this level of experience, right?
mm,
Like what are the kinds of valuable experiences we can have in our lives? And with respect to eudaimonia, I think it hits us at a deeper level, right? And so I tend to think that from a contemporary vantage point, what is really important at eudaimonia is that it allows us to function, right? Like when we are in a state of eudaimonia, right, we're really in a well-functioning state. And so in that sense, it's almost a precursor towards having these other good, really robust experiences. It's very different than the kind of Aristotelian understanding of flourishing, which for him was so wrapped up in reason that I think it
mm.
looks a lot more like the kind of life of meaning than in contemporary vantage points, because it's invoking that that aspect of reason, right? That has to be engaged and engaged in a very rational way.
Mm.
And but that was his conception of human flourishing. If we just take the concept eudaimonia and think about it in terms of, what from a contemporary vantage point we know about human flourishing, right?
Hmm.
We know we need we know we need social interaction. We know we need different kinds of experiences. We need to develop autonomy. We need to experience skill and competence. And when we have those things, then I think we're in a eudaimonic state of just ongoing well functioning, which sets us up really well to then have happy experiences or interesting ones or fulfilling ones.
Mm.
So is that's the fact that you said that. I'm trying to avoid using the word interesting
Mm.
right now because I almost said interesting. No, but so there's a quote from your book, "The good life is not a teeter-totter, but a three-legged stool." What you
Yes.
were just speaking about, at least like how you view eudaimonia, is that kind of like what that quote is referring to, or does it mean something different?
Yeah, so in thinking about the three-legged stool,
Right.
I am thinking about, well, the three legs of that stool are not the eudaimonic ones, but the three legs of that stool are that we need happy experiences,
Right. Okay.
interesting experiences, and fulfilling experiences. To tie in this suggestion of eudaimonia that I just talked about, that's like it has to sit in the ceiling. It has to sit, the stool has to sit on a stable floor.
Mm.
And so your three legs aren't going to do you any good if your floor is not stable.
Mm.
And uh, but really thinking about fulfilling what we need on a human psychological level, that's going to give us the stable floor from which we can sit on a stool. And so the three legs model is at the experiential level.
Oh wow. Okay. So I'm not gonna say it. So
Yeah. See,
you
we
know,
keep
I
wanting
know,
to
because
say it.
I know, I know. So and it's also because we're used to saying it because we do it all the time.
Yeah.
And then so
There's
yeah,
nothing wrong with that.
I know, I know, I know. And I'm just trying to avoid it because I'm like, oh my God, it's going to be so redundant at this point. Okay, but I am going to ask. So then what, so if somebody were to ask, because maybe this is not necessarily something answerable. Maybe this is something more spontaneous. But some of our listeners may ask, okay, but how do you sort of cultivate interesting, right? So what happens if, let's say, I'm bored a lot of the time? What happens if a lot of the things I find, they don't tend to be interesting to me? Then what do I do?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a lot that you can do. And one of the ways in which I think it's helpful to think about it is to develop a mindset, is to develop through practice, right? You can develop a mindset that'll really allow you to pivot very rapidly from boredom or really allow you just to find more interesting things out there. And so one thing that we can do, right, is really tap into our ability to notice things. And when psychological richness, the solid correlations that we know about it are novelty, complexity, and challenge. And so
Okay.
experience, anytime you're in one of those situations, right? Those are ripe for a psychological richness and to have an interesting experience. And so the first thing I think it can be really, really helpful is really just getting back to this such a fundamental point of just noticing what's going on around you. And so we can simply like look out the window, no matter what window. We could be, sitting out a window that we've grown up in and we've, looked at thousands of times, and we can find something new, right? You
Mm.
can just notice something going on. And the more you train your brain to notice things, right, then you're introducing, even very small doses of novelty, but they'll start stimulating your brain. And if you start then get in the habit of bringing some curiosity to the table and
Hmm.
really try to kick into a gear where you're like, oh, okay, well, I wonder what that's doing here, or I wonder why that shadow is marked there, right?
Mm.
So simply by bringing like our native sense of curiosity to the table, it'll point us to where where we'll find the interesting, and that's just by allowing us to question and wonder. And then the third thing, though, that I think is also really important is to be creative, and to find new connections and things, and to, not shy back from going out of the norm, and, breaking up your day to day with just something that is just a little bit more creative. That's a real source of interest. And so, with these things in particular, I think are really going to help us. The more we practice them and cultivate them in our minds, then, the more psychologically rich our lives will become without really even having to change a lot of other things out there, right? But
Mm.
by really just starting to look at the world in a different way that really invites interestingness.
Interesting. And then, so when somebody says something like, well, I'm not very creative, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say I hear you because I thought that for many years.
Hmm.
um, but this is it's really unfortunate. I mean, we all know this is a really common thing,
Hmm.
and what's really helpful for me to think about is what is the current understanding of creativity within the sciences, which is not about solely about artistic stuff
Sure.
or real kinds of or imaginative stuff, right? There's a kind of a caricature, right? Going to create to be creative, you've got to be imaginative, you've got to be, a great painter, you've got to like tap into and have this aesthetic appreciation.
Hmm.
But,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of us that just don't have that much. There's a lot of creativity that is out there because all creativity consists in is making new connections.
Mm.
And if we think about it that way, right? Everyone's creative, and it's all about just making new connections, right? And I think a lot of that, on the kind of ground level, that's a lot about just, introducing more novelty to your lives, right? Letting it in, letting your mind really go or connect with whatever's out there and go where it wants to go. So we can be creative in many more ways than we probably think. And it is all about just forming new connections. So we can change up a recipe, you can change up your handwriting, like
Mm.
it's all just about making new connections. And that's what creativity is. And we've all got it, right? So we can all be creative. We
Hmm.
just need to do it. Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. And another thing I recall from the book is also in terms of cultivating psychological richness was uh, shifting away from a sort of like the mode of pursuit and switching towards engaging with the present moment, right? That's also another way to sort of kind of bring yourself away from, or not bring yourself away, rather, to sort of just kind of cultivate that sort of lifestyle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
depending on who we are, right, the grip that planning has on us can be very, it can be very limiting. And so I often talk about the kind of pursuit mode that we get in, right? Where we're just have an expectation. We're just going after it, going after it, going after it. And what that does, we know it really kind of narrows our focus. And so the first and perhaps really helpful thing that people can do is really just try to loosen the grip of pursuit mode, right? Recognize when you're in it and try to limit its role in our lives. We all need to get stuff done, right? We
Of
all need to get
course.
stuff done.
Yeah.
But we can get stuff done and then still have the opportunities for other things if we can let ourselves out of that mode. And so there's a lot of openness to experience that is going on in the background here. And when you're in pursuit mode, you're really, you're closed off to a lot of experiences because you're pursuing the ones that you expect will be rewarding. And
Hmm.
yet we can bring more openness to our lives and bring more space to our lives
Hmm.
by really trying to recognize and narrow the grip that this pursuit mode has on us.
And can you talk about like the role that mindfulness and CBT might play in this?
Yeah, I think that it has a really fundamental basis. And when so the skill of noticing that I was talking about earlier, right? I really think that's a form of mindfulness, right? Where we're bringing a very non-judgmental, non-evaluative outlook elsewhere. And the key thing there, I think, is which is really helpful towards bringing more interesting experiences to our lives, is to get out of this evaluative mode, right? That's
Hmm.
another way in which we close our minds. We evaluate everything. And if we can practice simply, going about our days, experiencing things as they are without labeling or evaluating them, then we'll introduce so much more to our lives and we'll be open to so much more. And so that's, I think, it's a real mindfulness skill, right? And yet it's pointing the lens of mindfulness outward, right,
Mm,
to everyday environments. But it's that same kind of non-judgmental, non-evaluative awareness that we can bring anywhere, right? We can bring it inside to our thoughts, but we can also just bring it outside to our worlds. And when we're not evaluating or judging, we're being open and we're seeing things as they are, and we're allowing them to, stimulate other parts of our minds.
Would reframing play a role here or not so much?
Uh, it could.
Mm,
It depends on who, depends on what your tendencies
mm,
are, I guess.
mm, mm,
One of the things I've been advocating a lot is just to start, maybe go about your day and say, I'm not going to say good or bad today.
mm,
And
mm.
so that, I mean, that seems reframing,
Yeah, it does.
depending, for a while, my instincts were really like, oh, it's raining bad,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Or like really naturally things. And by really kind of like being aware of when you're doing that, particularly, I think we do it habitually, right? We
Of
just see
course. Yeah.
things as good or bad.
Mhm.
And so by flagging that when we're doing it and forcing ourselves to re-describe, then yeah, I think that's a form of reframing.
Yeah, yeah. And so why I love that is because I have to tell you. So some of my best sort of work with patients, and I'm not like going to talk about anybody specific, but I'm just going to kind of use an amalgam here. But some of my best work with patients, so when we do use the element that is called cognitive restructuring, what I love the most is not so much when somebody goes from bad to good. So even though sometimes it's warranted, right? But where somebody goes, "Oh, okay, tomorrow's going to be a good day as opposed to a bad day," just as an example. But what I really love, and because I've had several examples of this, where somebody would say, "Okay, so I did, I was doing a thought record and I felt like shit today. And I was thinking, okay, and so let's say I woke up in the morning and I started feeling like shit and I'm thinking I'm going to have a bad day, right? And I've had several people tell me this. So for some, they might reframe it as, oh no, based on the evidence, I'm going to have a good day. You can't really know that, right? So, but what I love is the reframe of actually, I might have a good day, right? Which is so different than I'm going to have a good day. So actually, I might have a good day means maybe I will, maybe I won't. But the idea is there's an open mindedness there. And there's also, I think, implicitly a sense that whatever happens, I can probably handle it. So whereas opposed to when somebody says something like it's going to be a good day, it's a little bit of a defense. I would say it's kind of denial maybe in some ways because like fundamentally what you're telling yourself is I know for sure I'm going to have a good day and everything is going to be all right. You can't really know that. So but when the person says actually I might have a good day, what they're saying is hey, here's this opportunity, maybe I'm involved in it, maybe I can help cultivate it, but the point is to say that here's this opportunity for me to actually have a good experience, but fundamentally it's not like something I need to live and die with. So meaning even if I have a bad day, it's not going to be the end of the world. So that's where I would apply, let's say, reframing to this, because if, let's say, you're looking at an experience, or let's say something that could potentially be interesting, I
Mhm.
think the thinking is here, well, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but I can't know unless I actually engage with it.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's great. And just giving you that little bit of distance. And it's amazing, right? Just the difference in space you get from thinking it's going to be a good day to it might be, right? And little anytime we can invite that openness to our lives, I think we're just going to make our lives better. And but we let other things in. We allow more possibilities. And so any kind of shift, absolutely, that we can make to introduce more openness to our experiences and to our approach to experiences is going to be great.
Mm.
Um, it's something I'm curious about. If somebody was hypothetically, let's say, deeply entrenched in let's say they habitually, like for example, we were talking about labeling before, and we are talking about maybe non-judgmentally observing things, noticing new things. If somebody's so deeply entrenched in that sort of mindset of like they must have a label for everything, even if they intellectually just now understood, oh wait a second, maybe this is going to bring a little more space into my life, and maybe I'll feel a little bit better if I don't label some things, and so I should give it a try, right? Let's say they intellectually heard that and they struggle regardless. In your opinion, because I'm just trying to also kind of suss out how I'm feeling about like how I would deal with that. Would you say that maybe then just trying just a little, like just try doing that for just maybe 1 minute of the day, or just try to like inject these little changes, but don't do something, don't completely try doing this for the whole day, because like obviously you'll
Burn
probably
yourself
fail at
out.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The more, and I think that's a real key to understanding this framework that I'm offering here is that it's in the little things, right? It can sound very, minor to say, well, look out your window and see something, right? But it's in these little moments, and the more of these little moments that we have, the more we're going to cultivate our mind to see things in a certain way, but also the more they'll just build up to enhance our lives. Much of the research around psychological richness is really exploring it as a way of living, right? And so, the psychological sciences are really interested in thinking about, well, what are the kind of long-term ways of living in a way that is more psychologically rich? And these are really, they're moments, and they really do have this cumulative impact of enhancing people's lives and delivering a greater, more expansive sense of self.
Uh-huh.
And so I think we have to be open to that possibility, and so also not judge the fact, well, this is so little, what could it do, right? But give ourselves a shot here, right? So
Of
yeah, if
course.
you need to say, well, take a moment and step back, and even just once a day, like reframe something, then I think that's great. We do what we can do, and we chip away. A lot of, one thing that I think is also important to emphasize in this context is that we're all coming from different starting points. And so there maybe some who, no matter where our starting points are, right, we can all start chipping away. And that's just going to look different depending where our starting point is, right? So if
Mhm.
there's someone who's saying, okay, a minute is going to be, you know, what I
Sure.
need, then
Yeah.
great, then that's what they need. And so it's all about just working with what you're starting from and trying to bring more openness to that position.
Oh, wow. And then, so I would also ask, in terms of the actual construct of interesting. So usually when we think of, when we like, let's say, think of books like self-help stuff or whatever, we get like books on awe, we get books on being a better thinker, we get books on being happy, a pleasure, whatever, right? So Stoicism, Aristotelianism, et cetera, right? So you are probably the first person I've seen who's actually created and wrote an entire book on just interesting. So how did that even come about that you thought, oh, okay, wow, this is actually an important element of a good life?
Yeah, well, the original research that I was involved with were these psychological studies, and we went into that project. It was a collaborative project we did. We got this grant to explore it, and we went into this project with trying to understand, I guess, primarily two things. So first we needed to figure out whether psychological richness described its own category that was not already contained by happiness or meaning, right? And that really quickly pans out to be true, right? We know, for example, you can have psychologically rich experiences that are also painful and cause struggle,
Mm.
and so they're not always going to be overlap with happiness. And likewise, you can have lots of psychologically rich experiences that aren't at all fulfilling or in that way. And so that's one really interesting thing. And then the research, and then we're trying to think, okay, well, so there is this set of phenomena. It's not already included in all of these different areas of looking at the good life. And then we're thinking about, well, is it good? Right? Should it be, right? You know, it's one thing to identify a phenomena. It's another thing to think about, like, well, does it really have an important role within our lives? And should we grant it that? And so the research, you know, the empirical studies were showing that a lot of people really would choose psychological rich life over happiness and meaning.
Mm.
And that's really important indication, right? That it is something that's really valuable. But from a philosophical perspective, right, we want to know more, right? You know, people can choose and want things, and that doesn't always mean that they're good things to have. And so at the philosophical level, I'm thinking about, you know, all of this pointers that we're getting towards saying there is something really valuable here. And trying to figure out what that was. And that's where it became, I don't know what it was that clicked on me, but at a certain point it just became very clear that, you know, actually it's all valuable because it's really interesting, and that's a value. And so in my work, what I've done is try to show that interestingness is a prudential value. Means it's always good for everybody. And it's different degrees, right? It'll be good for people in different degrees, but it's something I think that is actually very parallel to pleasure. And so, you know, happiness is good. You know, if we think about why happiness is a valuable part of the good life, right? It goes back to this kind of intrinsic value of pleasure that we know from Epicureanism and hedonism. And I think a parallel sense in which the interesting is valuable on its own. And so that's what led this kind of pursuit towards thinking that, or first towards recognizing the interestingness as being the valuable feature behind this. But that also, I think, put me on a really helpful path to think about how we can kind of break into psychological richness. Because if we think about it in terms of the interesting, then I think that really helps us to kind of tap into what really matters about having novel experiences or having complex or challenging ones. And to really, the more I think that, and this is what I advocate a lot in the book, right? The more we can understand what that feeling is inside of us, right? When it arises, then the better we'll be able to introduce more psychological richness to our lives. And that's the secret though, right? To think about, well, what does the interesting feel like to me? And then we can learn from that, but then we can also recognize, you know, when it's arising and being like, oh, okay, yeah, all right. So, you know, if you kind of feel the sparks of something, then recognize that, let them go. And so that's, I think, a really helpful way to think about how we can have more psychological richness by thinking about the interesting.
Yeah, and I can also imagine just evolutionarily speaking. I mean, it seems like the societies that probably flourished the most were the ones that were the most curious, were the ones that made the most discoveries, pretty much were the ones that found things most interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yo, it's I think this is actually um well, okay, so what I'm used to, I've been, and you know, historically speaking, like in conversations of the good life, Aristotle's dichotomy of eudaimonia and hedonism, it's dominated those discussions, right? Um, I find it interesting, one, that the art of the interesting has been has been not even been discussed or overlooked, right? But
But can I
I
just say this one quick thing? So we had a whole series on our show called "How to Live a Good Life" with God knows how many philosophers, from Buddhism to Confucianism, to Platonism to Islam, you name it. Right? Not one person mentioned interesting. Go ahead.
Right.
Yep.
And I guess this is just like a thought I'm having. I really hope that uh, this idea actually starts to be something that, you know, dominates those discussions as well, because uh, I don't know. You just do see only those two things mainly discussed. Am
Yeah.
I not? Am I crazy for saying that?
No,
Like,
I mean, technically speaking,
at least in conversations of the good life.
maybe
like,
Western, maybe in terms of like Western
when
ideologies,
you're
because
talking about
Buddhism,
Aristotle,
Confucianism is a little bit different. But I hear,
No,
you,
of course,
it's
yeah.
definitely overlooked. Yeah, it's usually like
Yeah.
it's the difference between sort of pleasure and sacrifice. If we want to narrow it down, it's like, is a good life the one that's sort of more meaningful and the one where you sacrifice and gain and strive and build whatever,
Right.
or is it the Epicureanism where you're like just constantly seeking pleasure? But yeah, you're right.
No, because here's the thing. Of course, when you get out of, let's say you you go out of philosophy and you start to dig into concepts like we were speaking about before, like flow state, for instance. Okay, great. Like there are sort of other disciplines that you would kind of go to. Okay, so I don't even know how to word this. I'm struggling to kind of get to this, but like for example, if I was gonna look for my version of the interesting while looking at like the concepts of eudaimonia and hedonism, I wouldn't have necessarily stayed with let's say either Western philosophy, or I would have just gone to a different discipline like maybe psychology. I don't know if that's a great way to
I
articulate
hear
that,
you.
but that's sort of what. Yeah, but I really love this idea, and I hope this just becomes like, again, like a dominating part of the discussion. Yeah. So,
And by the way, what's so interesting about that is that it's technically the foundation of all of these books. I mean, without curiosity, I mean, nobody would have written any of this stuff. So technically speaking, if these philosophers weren't interested in their topics, none of this would even be around.
of course, yeah, that goes without saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So as we begin to wrap up, Alan, final questions for Lorraine.
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Yeah, so you can first visit my website, lorrainebesser.com. And yeah, there you can find me I'm on social media, and so you can find my links there. I am it's at Lorraine Besser for Instagram, and LinkedIn Lorraine Besser. So I'm out there. So easy to find. You can start with my website, find my book anywhere. It's at your local bookstore, it's online. And
Excellent. Lorraine,
Great.
thank you so much for coming on.
This
This
is
was
awesome.
great.
Yeah.
yeah, thank you all. It was really great to talk to you.
Absolutely. Talk to you
Take
soon.
care.
All right.
All right. Great. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.